Welcome to the Latchkey Tales, Book 1, Yuki O'Malley and the Belfair, a tale of Victorian horror, written and performed for podcast by M.J. Hahn. Chapter 4, The Curse Castle. June 21st, 2008. Something slowly lumbered its way through the dark, dank sewer works deep beneath the city. Its thin tentacles were stronger than they looked, yet it still struggled as it pulled itself blindly along. Its sense of smell had weakened over the years. Now it merely crept and sulked, feeling its way about in the dark, searching for a forgotten place all alone. It had lost its way home so very long ago. The long finger of sunlight had worked its way across the room, landing squarely in Yuki's face. She made a few attempts to open her eyes, but failed. Her eyelids refused to budge. It seemed that the jet lag was holding them firmly shut. The dreamy, residual images of lonely, slithery skulking through dark tunnels slowly evaporated. Yuki barely managed to roll over and hide her face in the cool underside of her pillow. Gradually, her brain started to thickly tick away, dimly recollecting a cab ride after the airport, driving through the empty early morning city streets towards their new house, the huge towers looming overhead, then a foggy ride up in a brass elevator, then a large comfy bed and nothing else but blissful sleep. Yuki turned over and finally managed to raise her head. She pried open a single squinty eye and instantly brightened. Clearly, she wasn't in Tokyo anymore.
Hello, San Francisco.
Yuki propped herself up and admired the enormous bed and an even larger room blazing with sunlight. She was shocked at the size of the new accommodations. Space, so much space. The last place they had lived had been roomy by Tokyo standards, but it was nothing like this. Sunlight poured in and bathed the entire room with warmth. It reflected off of the polished hardwood floors and the bright white walls, which still smelled faintly of fresh paint. The view certainly wasn't hampered by a shortage of windows. The opposite wall was flooded with light. Yuki slipped out of bed and crossed the room, which ended in a tall, circular bay window. She could see out over the countless rows of apartment house rooftops. She turned and surveyed her room again, marveling at the incredibly tall ceiling, not to mention the ornate moldings which ran along the top of the walls like flowering vines. Clusters of tiny, blissfully faced cherubs looked down at her from the corners. Their small, ecstatic grins unsettled Yuki ever so slightly. She frowned, wondering whose room this had originally belonged to. Someone had arranged a mismatched collection of assorted furniture, an old-fashioned desk with a rickety swivel chair, some bookcases, a rather sad, wheezing, oscillating fan, and an ancient digital clock which read 3:34 p.m. Stacked at the far corner of the room towered the 23 meticulously packed boxes that had constituted Yuki's life. She remembered standing in the Tokyo condo, looking at her room crammed to capacity with the packed boxes. She distinctly remembered thinking that it had seemed like way too much stuff to bother with. How could anybody possibly need this much stuff? Now, Yuki looked at the pile of boxes and thought it seemed very small in comparison to the vastness of her new room, the idea of which appealed to her, but also scared her just a little. 3 doors stood opposite to the wall of tall, skinny-arched windows. One led to a large walk-in closet, one to Yuki's own bathroom, and the last was cracked open to reveal a long hallway and presumably the rest of the house. Yuki wandered out into the hallway, shivering with a sudden chill. It was deathly cold compared to her bedroom. The floorboards creaked under her feet, adding to the slightly creepy ambiance. More cherubs were looking down at her. This time they surrounded oval skylights set with blue-green glass. The eerie light shining down made it seem like everything was underwater. Yuki wrinkled her nose at the thick layer of grime and dust which seemed to be everywhere. There were even long dangling cobwebs hanging from the little shades on the wall sconces. Several ladders were leaning against the walls, and a large collection of paint cans were arranged on the floor. Clearly, the renovations were still underway. The hallway seemed to go on forever, and once again the unreal vastness of the house struck Yuki. It boggled her mind that the doctor somehow had failed to mention that this place even existed. But then again, Yuki's knowledge was more than a little abridged when it came to her own family history. Somehow she knew instinctively that perfect timing would be essential to get any details out of the doctor. After passing several empty rooms, the corridor opened out into a central hall. What looked like the front door of the flat was oddly enough standing open. A brass elevator could be seen beyond, which Yuki dimly remembered from before. Sunlight was streaming down another hallway to Yuki's right, and a large set of heavy dark wooden doors stood ominously closed in front of her. Yuki crossed the hall, somehow drawn to the double doors with a strange feeling of familiarity. She tried the handles, but they were locked fast. Not to be discouraged, she gave the handles another rattle just to be sure. The resulting clatter seemed to amplify unnaturally, reverberating in hissing echoes throughout the vast hall. The sudden noise seemed to have also stirred something behind the doors. Yuki pressed her ear against the wood and listened. Her eyebrows locked together. She was sure she had heard something. Was someone calling from behind the double doors? It wasn't a loud voice, more like an indistinct hissing whisper, a strange, barely perceptible sound. Yuki felt the tiniest cold twist of nausea in the pit of her stomach. The strange little man from the airport flashed through her mind, but almost as soon as she noticed it, the feeling went away and all was quiet again.
I'm afraid those doors are locked.
Yuki spun around with a start and met the gaze of a friendly-looking man with iron-gray hair and paint-spattered overalls.
Sorry, kiddo. Didn't mean to spook you. The name's Joe. Joe Halliday. Pleased to meet you. Guess you could say I'm the handyman around here.
Joe moved the drop cloth he had slung over his shoulder and extended a hand. Yuki shook it timidly as she introduced herself, at which Joe boomed with laughter.
You don't need to be all formal, kiddo. Like I wouldn't know who you are. You're the spitting image of your mom. Of course, maybe your hair's a bit different.
Joe smiled as his eyes scanned over the bits of Yuki's hair which were standing on end. Yuki noticed that Joe's dark eyes twinkled when he spoke. His weathered, handsome face went all wrinkly when he smiled, revealing a few gold teeth. He returned his gaze back to the double doors, and his smile faded.
That'd be the way to your grand's old part of the house. Been locked up since she passed. Can't imagine the state of things in there now. She never wanted any of us up here for years and years, you see.
Joe waved his free hand around.
And you may have noticed that your gran wasn't so big on cleaning.
There was an awkward pause as Yuki could only nod in agreement. Yes, the place seemed pretty filthy. Joe smiled and continued.
Anyway, kiddo, I'd better get out of here. Better not get caught loafing on the job.
Joe adjusted his drop cloth to the other shoulder and nodded down the corridor, which was flooded with sunlight.
Your mom's down that way. I'll see you around.
He smiled again, turned and headed for the front door, disappearing into the brass elevator. Joe's directions led Yuki to the newly redone part of the house. Renovations completed, everything had been modernized, walls knocked down to create one enormous open space. Only the rows of skinny arched windows gave away that it was the same house. No cherubs here, but there was another large bay window in the corner. It was similar to the one in Yuki's bedroom, except here there was an ornate brass staircase spiraling up to a circular walkway inside one of the ominous towers that loomed over the neighborhood. Definitely an unusual design feature. The space had been filled with lots of modern-looking furniture that was still wrapped up in the mover's plastic. There were packing crates stacked everywhere, filled with the eclectic collection of treasures they had accumulated during their travels. Yuki chuckled to herself, wondering how long it would be before any of the crates' contents saw the light of day. But it didn't really matter, because even practically empty, the room was already something special. Yuki crossed to the bay window and took in the amazing view. Stretched out before her was the cluster of skyscrapers that made up downtown, including an oddly shaped pyramid tower. The gray bay bridge sulked in the distance, leading to the hazy hills of the East Bay. The street below was lined with apartment houses, except for the opposite corner. Yuki smiled at the sight of the busy cafe across the street. Several small tables were set up outside under an awning where people were having coffee. Yuki couldn't believe it.
Wow, actual neighbors?
Well, good morning, lady. Or should I say afternoon?
The doctor was perched on a bar stool, seated at the enormous granite island in the center of the ultra-modern kitchen across the room. Yuki shot a nasty look at the laptop, which was attached, as usual, to the doctor's flying fingers. The doctor didn't look up from her typing.
Did you meet Joe?
Yuki nodded while her eyes returned to the spiral staircase and the walkway inside the tower above. She could see 4 curious little windows.
So, what do you think?
The doctor asked while her fingers continued to clack across the keys. Yuki muttered, then caught on to the doctor's question.
Oh, yeah, nice. It's really big.
Yeah, Joe's guys are doing a really great job. You should have seen this place before they started renovating.
How could I have done that? I didn't even know this place existed.
Yuki thought, bracing herself against the doctor's terminal cheerfulness while her foot closed in on the bottom step of the spiral staircase. The doctor suddenly looked up from her laptop.
Oh, you shouldn't do that. They haven't fixed it yet. It's not safe.
Okay.
Yuki said as her foot retreated, yet her gaze remained fixed on the 4 little windows above. She couldn't help wondering what there was to see out of them.
Here, you might like to look at this,
said the doctor, nudging over a large manila envelope across the vast expanse of granite. Yuki moved over and took it, surprised that the envelope was so bulky. She read the logo on the corner. Dermal and Femur, attorneys at law. Yuki opened the flap to reveal a thick stack of papers and something heavy sliding around at the bottom of the envelope. It was an old keyring. Yuki looked up, completely mystified.
It's the deed. To the house? It seems she went and left it to you.
She? Meaning the grandmother I never met?
Yuki thought. The doctor nodded slightly as if she heard this, then added with a wry smile.
But not until you're 18, so don't go getting any bright ideas.
The doctor's attention was distracted by the stranger that had just entered the room.
Ame? Oh, excuse me if this is a bad time. The front door was open.
Yuki was slightly shocked. Usually nobody ever called the doctor by her first name.
Hi, Meredy.
The doctor smiled, then added,
Yuki, this is Mrs. Flack. She works downstairs.
Mrs. Flack moved briskly across the room to shake Yuki's hand.
Oh, hello. A pleasure to meet you at last.
The woman was very pale. It was difficult to guess her age exactly. She wore a slender black suit with pointy high heels, black sunglasses, and a severe side part in her chin-length black bob. The only shock of color in her ensemble were her bright red lips. She smiled pleasantly, but her manner seemed slightly aloof and stiff. Yuki remained silent as Mrs. Flack released her hand. She remained inscrutable behind her dark lenses and turned back to the doctor.
I'm so sorry for the intrusion, but I was hoping to get your schedule so I can work out the remainder of the renovations with minimal fuss. The furniture, for example.
Mrs. Flack's red lips scowled at the yet-to-be-perfected living room while the doctor began searching around the kitchen.
Oh, yes, of course. I have my book here somewhere.
The doctor shuffled through her papers as Mrs. Flack's look of disdain deepened. Perhaps it was the doctor's chaotic filing method, or perhaps it was the doctor's vintage 80s t-shirt. Apparently, Mrs. Flack didn't care for a teenage knife fight. A sudden chirping from Mrs. Flack's handbag caught everyone's attention. In an instant, Mrs. Flack snapped open her bag and had her phone to her ear.
Hello?
Hello? Don't you hello me. Flack, where are you?
Oh, I'm upstairs seeing to some last-minute...
Confound it, Flack. There's time enough later for your wallpaper samples. We have a situation. A VIP situation.
Oh, I see. I thought we weren't doing
I
those.
thought we weren't doing those. Since when do I pay you to think? Mrs. Battery is flying in. She's due in 1 hour. Make sure she pays in cash this time.
As pale as she was, Mrs. Flack managed to blanch. Her phone slipped back into her handbag, her dark glasses slightly askew.
Well, I seem to be required elsewhere.
She straightened herself and turned to leave.
Oh, nice to see you again, Meredy. We'll talk later. We'll work it out.
The doctor looked back to Yuki and whispered under her breath.
See, you don't have it so bad. There are much worse bosses.
Before Yuki could present her contradictory theory, The meeting ended with the typical interruption, the doctor's cell phone and its predictable ring, as well as the usual intense discussion with the colleague. While the doctor chattered, Yuki rummaged through the kitchen, looking for any sort of sustenance. The only lived-in touch in the otherwise spotless modern showplace was where the doctor had set up the French press coffee maker, leaving dark circular stains on the otherwise pristine white granite. Yuki ended up staring blankly at the fridge, which only contained a large tub of unflavored Greek yogurt and a bottle of the doctor's Chardonnay. Not exactly a lot to eat.
Yeah, like the doctor would ever go grocery shopping.
Yuki turned with a sigh and saw that the doctor was waving a $20 bill and a pink plastic keychain in her direction. The doctor put her hand over her phone.
Go check out the neighborhood. We'll order takeout tonight, so don't be late.
The doctor blew a kiss and went back to her phone call. Yuki returned to her room, her eyes lingering on the strange double doors in the entry hall as she passed. After digging through a few boxes, Yuki managed to assemble a suitably cute outfit. Oddly inspired, she skipped the usual arsenal of clips and let her hair stick out wherever it wanted to, even helping it along with some of the weird hair product the infamous Tokyo stylist had given her. After a final check in the mirror, she was ready to venture outside. The brass elevator had only 2 buttons, conveniently labeled up and down. It descended with a little creak, and Yuki caught a glimpse of the lavishly decorated second floor. There were rich, blood-red carpets and several mirrors glinting from beyond the elevator's metal cage. Shortly after, the lift thumped to a halt on the ground floor, upon which the brass cage rattled open automatically. Yuki crossed the cavernous landing, clad in mahogany paneling so tall that it seemed to loom over her. An ornate antique table made of the same dark wood sat in the center of the hall. Sitting on the backs of 4 fearsome sphinxes was a rather alarming floral arrangement, an enormous spray of silver gladiolas, so effusive that they barely allowed Yuki enough room to squeeze by. The heavy front door creaked open, revealing a small wild garden and some marble stairs which led down to the street. The late afternoon air was warm and still. It was due to be a perfect summer evening. Once down on the sidewalk, Yuki had to crane her neck back to get a good look at the house. It wasn't exactly subtle. Coyle House rested high above, fortress-like on its massive foundation behind a tangle of low trees and slightly overgrown shrubbery. It was difficult to tell what color the house was supposed to be. Any color had faded under years of accumulated tarnish. Yuki also couldn't help noticing that the only windows which didn't have their curtains drawn was their own part of the newly renovated half of the 3rd floor. The north side tower that had belonged to her grandmother was decidedly dark, and the other windows of the north wing seemed to glower blankly down at her. With her eyes still glued to the house, Yuki continued along the sidewalk until laughter and voices from the cafe across the street caught her attention. The golden calf looked like it had been there for some time. It definitely had a sort of lived-in charm. A striped awning wrapped around the front of the building, shading several clusters of small tables. As Yuki approached, she saw that the faces of a small crowd were all pointed in the same direction, each avidly watching the chess game in progress at the corner table by the window. Yuki had to do a double take when she saw the players, 2 little old ladies who were the mirror image of each other. They each wore identical satin tracksuits, except one was in hot pink and the other was in bright acid yellow. They sported matching puffy platinum blonde hairdos, each with a coordinating plastic visor tilted at a jaunty angle. Pink looked up from her move and winked at Yuki. Yellow didn't budge, still staring intently down at the chessboard. Pink moved her final piece with audible gasps from the onlookers and captured her opponent's king. Yellow grumbled a few choice words, which were mostly drowned out as the small crowd burst into applause. Pink looked up with a little smirk and gave Yuki another wink. Yuki stepped inside the golden calf and was immediately surrounded by the smell of freshly ground coffee and toasted bread. She joined the long line of people who were waiting patiently at the counter to place their orders. The walls were crowded with autographed black and white headshots of various smiling actors and local personalities. They all seemed to be grinning impishly down at the crowded tables that ran along either side of the slightly narrow space. The only empty chair seemed to be at the corner table by the window. It sat vacant next to a rather surly-looking boy with a mop of black hair who had his face hidden behind a large weather-beaten book. From where she stood, Yuki could read the title on the book's cover, The Spectral Encyclopedia. As Yuki puzzled over the curling script, she became aware that the boy's dark eyes had emerged over the edge of the book, scrutinizing her from under the shadow of his black droopy bangs. Yuki felt her cheeks burning and turned around as nonchalantly as possible, suddenly becoming interested in the black and white headshots which were facing the opposite direction. The cafe was busy, yet somehow the line didn't seem to be moving very much. Yuki peered down the row of people and then noted that there was only one person working behind the counter. Sloane Golden was 40-ish. She still sported the short, bleached white Billy Idol hair and smudgy black eyeliner of her glory days. Currently, she was having an uphill battle against the mounting orders for coffee drinks and was getting zero assistance from her son. Her head emerged through the haze of the palpitating espresso maker. The steam may as well have been coming out of her ears. Her voice bellowed down the length of the cafe.
Crowley, if you're not too busy, get over here!
The boy with black hair looked up with a start. He closed his book, spread out his belongings so as not to lose his table, and marched sulkily behind the counter. Instantly, the gridlock was broken and the line began to move. Yuki watched as the boy deftly worked the espresso maker, turning out one expertly poured cappuccino and cafe latte after another. The customers all seemed very friendly, greeting and thanking Crowley by name as they received their steaming coffees in large, slightly misshapen ceramic mugs. Yuki read the "What Green Means" sign on the counter, informing her that the Golden Calf was doing its part for the environment by using homemade coffee mugs, which were all available for purchase. See management. Crowley looked up and caught Yuki staring again. She averted her eyes, willing herself not to blush, only to meet Sloane's slightly quizzical gaze from behind the counter. It was then that Yuki realized she was at the front of the line.
Hi, hon. What do you have?
Yuki scanned the chalkboard that was hanging from the ceiling. There were too many choices, and she didn't recognize most of them. Sloane snapped her gum and began tapping her pen on the cash register. She cracked a crooked smile, noting Yuki's overloaded expression.
Okay. How about we start you off with a nice hot chocolate? Crowley here would love to help you, wouldn't you, son? I gotta get out of here for a second. I'm off for a smoke before the next rush starts.
Sloane stepped around the counter behind Crowley, giving him a sly look as she sauntered away. Crowley flinched, and there was a hissing sound that had nothing to do with the espresso maker.
So, is hot chocolate okay?
Yuki nodded rather meekly, and Crowley smiled.
Okay then.
Yuki found herself staring again while the boy went to work mixing syrups and steaming the milk. She noticed that his fingers were stained purpley black, like he had dipped them in ink. But before the thought about how this particular detail wasn't exactly appetizing could form itself, Yuki was staring at the boy's eyes again, and all was forgiven. They were definitely hazel, somewhere between green and brown with tiny flecks of copper, and he had the darkest, thickest eyelashes.
Here you go.
An oversized mutant coffee mug full of steaming hot chocolate rocked precariously on the counter. Yuki blinked and Crowley snickered.
Yeah, my mom makes them. No paper cups here.
Crowley finished his sentence with a little sigh, like the joke had gotten old ages ago. He motioned to Yuki's hair, which looked a little windblown despite the lack of a breeze.
So, where'd you get that haircut?
Perhaps misunderstanding that Crowley meant the question to actually be a compliment, Yuki launched into a brief tirade about Tokyo hairdressers. Crowley nodded sagely.
Yeah, I didn't think you were from around here. But then, hardly anybody's actually from here.
Yuki brightened as she tucked a few errant strands of hair behind an ear.
Well, for your information, I'm from here. Well, just moved back here. I live over there.
Yuki gestured across the street, and Crowley's eyes popped.
You live in the Curse Castle?
A sudden silence descended, and heads in the cafe turned. Yuki looked shocked.
The what?
Just some local gossip, I guess.
Yuki glanced around and saw various customers suddenly returning to their laptops and newspapers. She sensed that they were still intently eavesdropping. Sloane Golden returned from her cigarette break, relieving Crowley of his counter duties for the moment. He motioned to his corner window table, which had remained miraculously undisturbed.
Looks like the only seat we've got left is next to me.
While Sloane rolled her eyes, Yuki grabbed her wobbly mug and joined Crowley.
My name's Yuki, by the way.
She said as she sat down.
Ah, that's cool. It means snow in Japanese.
Yeah, my grandmother picked it. I'm not sure why. It never snows here, does it?
Crowley shook his head and smirked.
You think that's bad? Try living with my name. In case you hadn't noticed, my mom's a little bit of a freak.
Yuki grinned and glanced discreetly towards the counter, where Sloane was glowering over a row of wobbly coffee mugs.
Yeah, I got that.
Don't mind old Mom. She's mostly harmless. Unless you manage to get her really pissed off, then she'll go all punk rock on you.
The people watching from Crowley's corner window table certainly was prime. Outside it looked like Pink and Yellow were setting up a new chess game. Pink winked at Yuki again through the glass, and Crowley chuckled.
That's Rosie von Bruin. She's a little loopy. The other one's name is Daisy. They're kind of fixtures around here.
Aw, I think they're cute.
Yeah. Until you get on Rosie's bad side, then man, you don't want to know.
The two continued to chat, and Yuki was amazed how at ease she felt around this cute boy with the stained fingers. It was like they had been friends forever. She learned that Crowley was 14 and had just finished his freshman year at Veracity High School. He was a San Fran native, and his family had been in the city for generations. The Golden Calf had been around for as long as Crowley could remember. He had grown up in one of the upstairs flats until his parents had separated. Now he split his time between the Golden Calf and his dad's apartment in the Haight-Ashbury. And when Yuki couldn't help asking about why her house was known as the Curse Castle, she learned a few other details as well. Apparently, Yuki's family house had quite a spooky reputation that went back years and years.
I used to see this lady standing in one of the tower windows. Ever since I was little, I would just look up and see her standing there, completely still, just looking out over the city.
Crowley trailed off a little awkwardly, noting Yuki's somewhat agape expression. He quickly changed the subject, launching into a tale about one of his recent exploits while he wiggled his stained fingers. Apparently, one of the jocks had made a remark about his hair, which was dyed green at the time. Moldy locks was what had set him off, and a fight of sorts had broken out. Naturally, Crowley was seen as the guilty party.
Yeah, let's just say that green hair isn't exactly encouraged at Veracity.
Needless to say, the resulting suspension for the last 2 weeks of school before summer vacation did not sit very well with Sloane.
And the black hair dye stains all over the bathroom weren't a huge hit either.
Suspended as well as grounded, these days Crowley was always under his mother's thumb at the Golden Calf. It was just at the moment that Yuki was going to ask what the whole spectral encyclopedia thing was about that she noticed a tiny commotion spreading around the tables outside under the cafe's awning. Daisy and Rosie von Bruin were pointing across the street at the Curse Castle, or more specifically, at the sleek black limousine that had pulled into the short driveway. It lingered there for only a moment before the black iron gate swung inward and it disappeared into the shadows. The sound of the iron gate clanking shut rang out clearly from across the street, and Rosie von Bruin turned, suddenly appraising Yuki through the glass with a stony expression. Yuki was silent, remembering the phone call Mrs. Flack had received earlier, announcing the arrival of their VIP client. Yuki snapped out of her thoughts as Rosie von Bruin suddenly turned to Crowley, tapped on the glass, and pointed to her coffee mug. Crowley sputtered and made to get up when Sloane suddenly whisked by, coffee carafe in hand.
Oh, don't let me disturb you. I can see you're busy. Heaven help us if Rosie has to wait too long for her refill.
A few customers chuckled. Yuki learned that this had only happened once before. It had involved an ambulance, several smashed coffee mugs, and a few bruised bystanders. Crowley bit his lip as Sloane wended her way through the cluster of tables until she reached the sisters. She refilled their mugs as they both leaned in and began to whisper, resulting in Sloane's head tilting back and forth between them as she listened. With a start, Sloane suddenly stood up straight, looked over her shoulder at the Curse Castle, and then turned and leveled her gaze directly at Yuki through the glass.
Uh-oh. She knows.
Huh?
There was some stuff that went down over there back in my mom's day.
Some kids disappeared. Yuki watched Sloane's expression harden as she made her way back inside the cafe. Then she turned to Crowley and saw the mounting panic spread across his face. Before Yuki could ask what was happening, there was a hand on her shoulder and her chair was being pulled out from under her.
I'm sorry, miss. Crowley here is grounded and needs to get back to work.
Mom! Crowley looked clearly mortified as all heads in the cafe turned.
And I'm sure your little girlfriend here has to get back home across the street.
Yuki suddenly found herself being not so subtly escorted to the door. Crowley sunk in his chair and rubbed at his forehead as Sloane turned and loomed over him. Bewildered, Yuki found herself outside and couldn't help noticing that everyone, especially the Von Bruin sisters, seemed to be staring at her. With downcast eyes and her cheeks burning, she bolted for the sidewalk and the fastest route to get out of sight. Rather than suffer the humiliation of being seen crossing the street towards the Curse Castle, she took an abrupt left once she was out from under the cafe's awning. Yuki wandered up the block a little ways and then stopped. The view from her room had been deceptive. The remainder of the street was hardly bustling. The storefront next to the cafe was vacant, and across the street there was only a lonely dry cleaner's. The rest of the block was made up of apartment houses as far as the eye could see. Yuki sighed, realizing that there really wasn't much to her new neighborhood except for the cafe, which somehow she had just gotten herself thrown out of. She crossed the street feeling deflated and turned back, heading towards her most infamous home. Yuki peeked over discreetly as the cafe came back into view. The chess game under the awning was in full swing once again, and no one seemed to notice her. She could see Crowley, still sitting in the window with his head lowered. Sloane was standing over him, barking and waving her arms. Yuki gathered that was what going all punk rock looked like. Apologizing to Crowley under her breath, Yuki walked on towards the Curse Castle as dusk began to fall. As the sun sank behind the skyline and the fiery dusk cooled into an evening violet, Yuki arrived home to a dark and empty house. There was not a soul in sight as she let herself in and rode the brass elevator back up to the 3rd floor. She opened the door to their flat and called out.
Hello?
No one answered. Yuki walked down the hall towards the living room and all was quiet. The laptop sat on the granite work surface quite unattended. It seemed that the doctor was out. Yuki crossed the darkening room and stood in the bay window. She looked down at the street with a little sigh. The Golden Calf was closing for the night. She could see Sloane carrying the little tables and chairs inside, yet Crowley was nowhere to be seen. The Von Bruin sisters were slowly ambling their way up the hill, arm in arm, chattering back and forth all the while. It was then that a sudden noise from behind caused Yuki to snap her head around and listen. She stood frozen, waiting for the front door to slam and the doctor's voice to announce that dinner had arrived. There was only silence. Yuki moved to the kitchen's granite island, which offered a better view down the hall, and listened. A moment passed, and then she heard it again. A faint hissing whisper that echoed down the entry hall from the direction of the double doors. Yuki felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up as she looked down to see the manila envelope resting on the counter where she had left it earlier. As if on automatic, she opened it and fished out the key ring and the old keys inside. And before she knew it, Yuki was standing in front of the north wing's double doors. She pressed her ear against the heavy wood and listened. Whatever she had heard, she couldn't hear it now. Not to be discouraged, Yuki fiddled with the key ring until she found a suitable match for the ancient lock. The key fit perfectly and turned like it was new. Yuki opened one of the doors, just the slightest crack, and peeked inside. The north wing was draped in shadows, looking completely forgotten. Yuki felt along the wall until she found the light switch. A single cobweb-covered chandelier was all that flickered to life. In the dim light, Yuki could make out a hallway that was crowded with stacks of newspapers and magazines. There seemed to be piles of newspaper everywhere Yuki looked, some of them towering taller than herself, creating a sort of makeshift maze to navigate her way through. Everything was covered with a thick layer of dust like it had been untouched for years. And then, from somewhere beyond, A little chill ran down Yuki's spine as the strange whispering sound started up again. Yuki crept down the remainder of the hall, trying not to make a sound. Once she was clear of the newspapers, the hallway opened up into a larger space. Darkened doorways led to even darker hallways. The air was heavy somehow, like it had settled comfortably after being unbreathed for so long. It seemed to resist being stirred up. Somewhere in the deepening shadows, the whisper hissed again. It sounded closer this time, and Yuki tried to zero in on the source. She entered a shadowy room and found herself standing in an alcove. Another tingle worked its way down Yuki's spine. Towering over her were shelves containing row after row of neatly arranged white porcelain ginger jars. They looked hand-painted, each detailed with intricate designs in blue. In the murky light, they glowed with an odd luminescence. Yuki looked closer and realized that they looked more like urns rather than jars, and one of them was rattling. The whispering hiss came again, louder this time. As soon as Yuki's eyes locked on the urn, she felt a twist of nausea in the pit of her stomach. Undaunted, she reached as high as she could and picked up the hissing urn. It vibrated at her touch, tickling her fingers. Yuki held the urn in front of her with a firm grip and inspected it closer. The lid had been sealed shut with a layer of thick black wax. Yuki shook the urn gently, thinking that it felt like it was filled with sand. Then, as if reacting to her touch, there was a sudden jolt, and Yuki was shook so violently that the urn slipped from her grasp and fell crashing to the floor. A cloud of ash blew up into the air, swirling around Yuki like a vortex. Suddenly she was lifted up off of her feet and tossed around like a rag doll. Yuki's mind was filled with flashing images of thrashing anger as a wave of nausea rose in her like a scream. She was flung back down the corridor through a storm of flying newspapers and dust, the screams still ringing in her ears until she blacked out. Yuki burst out of the double doors, flew across the entry hall, and landed conveniently on a mound of drop cloths. The cloud of ash continued to swirl and roil around the hall until it evaporated into thin air. Sometime later, after the doctor had finally returned home and tucked her daughter into bed, she put the Chinese takeout in the fridge and fired up her laptop while making a mental note to ask Yuki if sleeping in the hallway was going to be a regular thing. Meanwhile, across the street in the basement of the Golden Calf, Crowley was rummaging through one of his mom's deep storage closets. After some effort, he had made it clear to the back where his mom kept all of her stuff from the 80s. He had already stumbled onto one treasure, the motorcycle jacket that Sloane had worn when she was hardcore. It positively reeked of vintage cool, complete with flaming skulls and holy terrors painted on the back. Crowley tried it on and was surprised that it actually fit him. He sifted through the remainder of the boxes until he found the one in particular he was looking for marked School Records. Crowley flipped the lid open and began sifting through the folders stacked inside. Finally, at the bottom of the box, he found it. A purple folder with Oddfellows Teen Adjustment Center stamped across its cover. Crowley's eyes lit up as he flipped through his mother's file. There it was, all the ammunition he would ever need if his mom ever dared mention the word delinquent again. Then, tucked between two of the file's pages, Crowley found a photo of 4 teenage girls. He laughed out loud. There was his mother in her flaming skull leather jacket. Then Crowley's smile faded. There was a yellow post-it stuck on the back of the photo. Someone had written hastily on it, yet Crowley could still read it. Belfair, Bleeberman Makeover, December 9th, 1984, 10 p.m. Crowley arched an eyebrow. The name struck a chord. Bleeberman. Hadn't that been the name of one of the girls who had disappeared way back? Whoa, that's weird, Crowley thought as he read the post-it once more. A little chill ran down his spine as his eyes lingered over the word Belfair. And so, Chapter 4 comes to a close. I'd like to thank guest voices on this episode, Leanne Parker as Yuki, Sally Clausen as the Doctor, and Jennifer Viale as Mrs. Flack. Music on the program provided by freesound.org and incomtech.com. For more information, please check out latchkeytales.com or the Latchkey Tales fan page on Facebook. Please stay tuned for Chapter 5. And until then, this is MJ Hahn saying goodbye for now, and thanks for listening.
Oh.